All right. Well, my clock shows 1 o'clock Eastern time. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today on our webinar. Today, the chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, Wayne Miller, will be summarizing the proposed changes for the next edition of USPAP based on what is currently in the fourth exposure draft. Wayne, would you like to introduce yourself quickly, and then I will do the same?
Well, I am Wayne Miller. I am chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. This is my third year as chair, if my math is right. And I'm happy to be with you today to discuss these important proposed changes. Lisa?
Great, thank you. And I'm Lisa Damaris. I am the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I'm just hosting the webinar. Wayne is going to do all of the important work today for us. So before we begin, I just have a quick few housekeeping notes that I want to run through. We are recording this webinar, and you should be able to see that post to our website and to our YouTube channel in less than, I don't know, I estimate maybe 24, 48 hours at the very most. Time permitting, at the very end of the presentation, we will answer some questions that people have asked. If you would like to pose a question, be sure and post that in the chat box whenever you think of that. And I'm going to be viewing them as the webinar goes on and collecting those. And at the very end, like I said, if we have time, I will pose those to Wayne and he will answer them. To open up the chat box, you can just push Alt-H and the chat box pulls up. I would recommend you keeping that open because Joellen and Aida will be posting any links or information that you might need that Wayne refers to throughout the webinar. At the very conclusion of the webinar, we're going to have a very quick and brief survey will pop up. We hope that you will take a moment just to fill that out. It helps us improve our webinars in the future. Now, for the benefit of our listeners, the next two slides, we want to go to slide number 4. Here we go, the agenda. This slide provides an overview of the agenda we're going to follow today. First, we're going to be discussing the proposed new requirements to include inspections in the scope of work disclosure in the reporting standards. Next, Wayne will be discussing changes to other reporting requirements in standards 2, 8, and 10. Oh, you can go back one slide. There we go. Then we will discuss proposing revisions to the preamble. Next, we're going to move on to propose changes to the certification language, clarifications regarding signing of certifications, and edits to some wording in the certification sections of the standards rules. The agenda part 2, which is the next slide, yes, we will move on to our proposed edits to some definitions. Then we're going to discuss and propose other edits to improve the clarity of USPAP. And then finally, we will discuss updates that are proposed to pronoun usage in USPAP. And as I noted before, time permitting, we're going to have a Q&A session and then followed up by some real quick instructions on how you can submit your comments to the Appraisal Standards Board regarding the exposure draft. All right, Wayne, you want to give us an overview of the changes proposed to the reporting standards in section 1, which if you're following along in your exposure draft, it starts on page 5.
Well, I'm happy to do so, Lisa. And when I'm referring to pages or slides, it's going to be of the presentation as opposed to of the exposure draft itself. Lisa will provide you some reference points for the full exposure draft as we go. So as indicated here on this slide, there are 3 main areas in which changes are being proposed in section 1 of the exposure draft. The first is disclosure of whether or not an inspection was performed, the withdrawal, actually, of a previous proposal to delete what is a repeating comment, and renumbering of a portion of Standard Rule 6-2.
Okay, then I will direct everybody, again, if they have their exposure draft, to look at page 6 of their exposure draft. And then Wayne, can you get into the details here a little bit? What changes is the Appraisal Standards Board proposing with regard to the disclosure of inspection?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, due to the evolving developments in the marketplace, such as the use of third-party inspectors, unmanned aerial devices, which are also known as drones, and video inspections, The current binary wording in the certification, which reads, I have or have not conducted a personal inspection, may no longer have the same meaning to clients and intended users that it once had. And judging by the questions the ASB has received, appraisers are increasingly uncertain about what qualifies as a personal inspection and whether and how to convey relevant information to the intended users if someone else completes the inspection. So as such, the ASB is proposing to expand the scope of work reporting in standards 2, 4, 6, and 8. So appraisers are required to clearly communicate whether or not an inspection was performed. Additional requirements would be to state the date or dates of the inspection, the type and extent of the inspection, and the party or parties who conducted the inspection. We realize that appraisers, clients, and other stakeholders will have questions about these proposed requirements. So it's a good time to advise our listeners that the ASB is currently drafting proposed edits to the advisory opinion 2, as well as other advisory opinions, in an effort to provide guidance surrounding the topic of inspection disclosure. And although the adoption of changes to USPAP is different as it regards the adoption of changes to guidance, the ASB does plan to release a supplemental exposure draft of the proposed revisions to advisory opinions over the next few weeks. In the end here, the goal is for the appraiser to convey to the client or other intended users the what, when, and who surrounding the inspection if one is completed.
Okay, Wayne. So the text that is displayed here on the screen indicates that this change is proposed for Standards Rule 2-2A. Are similar changes proposed elsewhere in USPAP?
The short answer is yes. For purposes of the webinar on this issue and a few others, we will only display the proposed changes in 2-2A, the requirement for a real property appraisal report, and 2-2B, the requirements for a real property restricted appraisal report. But similar changes are proposed in standards 4, 6, and 8 for appraisal review, mass appraisal, and personal property appraisal reporting. It is important to note that in the third exposure draft, the ASB had proposed that in 2-2A, again, that's the reporting requirements for an appraisal report, big A, big R, the appraiser would be required to summarize the inspection details in an appraisal report versus stating them in a restricted appraisal report. But based upon the comments received, the ASB is now proposing in this fourth exposure draft to include the simpler requirement to state in both report types as a minimum requirement. Of course, if a more robust disclosure is necessary to tell the story, the appraiser can certainly expand the inspection disclosure. Also, as will be revealed later in our discussion, if this change is adopted, there would be updates and revisions to the certification as well as to the definition of personal inspection.
Okay, moving on to this next slide here. What other revisions are proposed to Standards Rule 2-2?
Well, the highlighted change, I guess we'll say the change in red text at the bottom of the screen here actually reflects existing wording that's in the reporting standard. So in prior exposure drafts, the ASB had proposed deleting this comment from the reporting standard since it repeats verbatim wording that is already present in the scope of work rule. However, based upon stakeholder feedback indicating that this is a good reminder to appraisers, the ASB has withdrawn the plan to delete the comment. So the net effect is we're now proposing not to take this comment out. We're going to leave it in.
Okay, then tell us about the change that is proposed to Standards Rule 6-2 on slide 10. Go ahead.
The primary goal of this revision is actually a continuation of a proposal from earlier exposure drafts. The ASB proposes to renumber this section to better delineate two different requirements that are currently listed together in Standards Rule 6-2G. The first of these requirements is to summarize the scope of work, and the second is to explain the exclusion of the approaches. As noted here on this page, if we do split these requirements, this will make the numbering of Standards Rule 6-2 consistent with the other reporting standards rules.
I hear what you're saying there, Wayne, but there seems to be a lot more going on this slide. Can you comment on that?
Certainly. There is a lot going on here primarily due to the proposed change regarding the reporting of inspection details. A lot is happening here. We've covered most of these concepts already on earlier slides. However, since it is here right in front of us, I'll point out one nuanced difference in the inspection disclosure for mass appraisals. Remember, we're in Standard 6, which is reporting of mass appraisals. So in the other reporting standards, the proposed requirement is to state the date or dates of inspection. However, let's recall that a mass appraisal is an appraisal of a universe of properties, a large number. Thus, the proposed wording in 6-2G includes the phrase or range of dates. When we think of mass appraisal, we often think of ad valorem appraisal or appraisal for property taxation purposes. In such a case, it's not really feasible to list the individual dates of inspection for, say, 10,000 or 20,000 parcels of real property. Thus, a range of dates, say between March 1st and September 30th of a given year, is a more appropriate disclosure here.
Regarding slide 11, or page 9, if you're looking at your exposure draft, can you give us a quick overview of the topics addressed in section 2 of the exposure draft and other proposed changes to reporting requirements?
Certainly, at the risk of seeming like I'm reading this slide to you. The changes noted on slide 10 here involve deletion of a phrase that has created confusion for some regarding the receipt of an appraisal report by someone who is not an intended user. And the second item that we'll address here is a rewording of the introduction to standards rules 2-2, 8-2, and 10-2, as well as the deletion of repetitive text in the reporting standards.
Okay, well, tell us more about the potential deletion of the phrase regarding disclosure obligations.
Well, this is a continuation of a general proposal from the earlier exposure drafts in this cycle. However, the comment in this exposure is proposed to be reworded slightly. For context, let's remember that an intended user is one who is identified as such by the appraiser in the assignment and in the report. Some stakeholders have expressed confusion regarding the current wording of this comment, which sets forth a specific incidence when a recipient of a report does not become an intended user. The wording in this comment implies that there may be cases where a mere recipient of a report does become an intended user. And that's not the case here.
Mm-hmm.
The second change is the substitution of the word recipient for the word party in this comment. Party often has a quasi-legal connotation, typically referring to someone who has a formal interest or standing in something, such as the parties to the transaction or parties to a contract. In this case, the term recipient was concluded to be the more appropriate term to describe individuals or entities that may just receive an appraisal report, but are not intended users. Thus, the overall rewording of this comment is designed to enforce the concept that someone who receives a copy of an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report does not become an intended user merely by the nature of receiving the report.
Moving on to the slide you see here, which is page 14 in your exposure draft. What other revisions are proposed to Standards Rule 2-2?
Well, in this case, the ASB believes that the rewording of the introductory paragraphs eliminates redundancy and improves readability and understandability, but really does not represent a material change in the requirements. As displayed here on slide 12, we are proposing to begin Standards Rule 2-2 with the statement, the content and level of information provided in an appraisal report must be appropriate for the intended use and intended users of the appraisal. Thus, the statement does not need to be repeated at the beginning of the content requirements for each report type.
Now, can you introduce us to the revisions that the Appraisal Standards Board is proposing to the preamble?
Certainly. Without giving away the content of the next slide, I'll just state that the ASB proposes to revise 2 sentences of the preamble.
Well, it looks like here they are. This displays those changes. So can you give us a little background on this?
Well, certainly. The first proposed change is to highlight requirements from the ethics rule that are fundamental to public trust in appraisal practice and really deserve greater attention in the context of current events, namely the appraiser's responsibilities to be impartial, objective, and independent. The additional proposed revisions are intended to underline the distinction between the task of development and the task of communication, and to help emphasize the USPAP requirement for an appraiser to be both ethical and competent.
We are now in section 4 of the exposure draft, which is on page 15. Can you, Wayne, give us a quick overview of the proposed changes in section 4 of the exposure draft regarding the certification and signatures?
I'm happy to do so, Lisa. As noted on slide 15 of the presentation, there are 2 areas in which changes are being proposed. The first is changes to the certification wording itself, and the second is changes to the signature wording to accommodate evolving methods of signing an appraisal report, including an administrative edit for consistency and one clarification to a comment here.
Wayne, this proposed change here looks familiar based upon our earlier discussion about reporting.
Well, you are correct. As I noted a few slides back, this change runs in parallel with the changes proposed to the scope of work reporting requirements being proposed for the reporting standards. It would replace the binary I have or have not made a personal inspection wording with wording that indicates the appraiser has disclosed in the report whether or not an inspection was made, and if so, when and by whom. A second edit is proposed in this 4th exposure draft. As we discussed earlier, the impetus for moving the inspection disclosure to the reporting rules was to allow USPAP to adapt to evolving methods of inspections. And we hope that the proposed changes will accomplish that objective. However, in many appraisers' practices, the inspection process has not changed. Thus, in cases where the disclosure is fairly straightforward, instead of referring the reader to other parts of the report for the disclosure of the inspection details, the appraiser can continue to make that disclosure in the certification. As an example, if a real property appraiser performs a single unit residential appraisal and personally inspects the interior and exterior of the property, the appraiser could include this disclosure in the certification itself, indicating the date or dates of the inspection, the extent of the inspection, and identifying the appraiser as the party who performed the inspection. After all, the certification is part of the report, and the scope of work can be disclosed in any part of the report.
Turning now to page 17 in your exposure draft, which is, looks like slide 18 here. Wayne, why is the ASB proposing to amend Standards Rule 2-2B and 2-3C, as well as the parallel standards rules for the other disciplines regarding the nature of the signature on the certification?
Well, the changes proposed on this slide represent a further refinement of changes that were proposed in the 3rd exposure draft. So As a bit of a history lesson, in years past, when an appraiser signed an appraisal, it meant that the appraiser printed out paper, took an ink pen, and physically signed the page. These days, it's less common for there to be a wet signature on a printed page since most reports are delivered digitally. USPAP has used the term sign for many years. However, with the continued technological advancements in the electronic delivery of appraisal assignment results, the concept of a signature continues to evolve. As we studied this issue, the ASB realized that USPAP already had an answer for this seeming conundrum. The management section of the ethics rule refers to an appraiser affixing one's signature rather than requiring appraisers to sign their work. And while one could argue that sign and affix a signature are synonymous terms, the changes proposed in this section makes the wording consistent with the ethics rule, changing signs to affixes a signature.
The next slide here, slide 19, seems to reflect relatively minor changes to the wording. Can you provide our listeners with the background on these proposed changes?
Well, sure. Lisa, for the first time, you're absolutely correct. The clause is required to is used in Standard Rule 2-3C1. However, elsewhere in USPAP, the term must is used. And this change would really just make this rule consistent with requirements in other parts of USPAP. The second item cleans up some wording in the comment for this standards rule. We believe that the new wording is simpler and emphasizes the main point, which is that the appraiser's disclosure of the extent of assistance may be in any part or parts of the report.
Moving on here to slide 20, which is page 22 in your exposure draft. Please give us some details of the proposed changes to the scope of work. Rule, sorry.
Scope of work rule, yes,
Yes,
here we are.
Rule.
Well, as in prior exposure drafts, here in section 5 of this exposure draft, the ASB continues to propose the deletion of the statement, proper disclosure is required because clients and other intended users rely on the the assignment results. I cut your
Yeah, sorry.
All right, that's all right. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't think that this is true. It just means that, stakeholders provided some feedback on this in response to an earlier exposure draft, questioning, why this type of explanation is required here and only in the scope of work rule. So rather than put it in a bunch of places, after considering the matter, the ASB is just proposing to delete this portion of the comment. An appraiser is required to understand the intended use of the appraisal report, so this comment seems redundant.
Page 23 of the exposure draft, which here is slide 21. Wayne, there are some revisions to a few existing definitions, the deletion of one, as well as a few new definitions proposed in the exposure draft. Can you briefly cover these potential changes?
Certainly, yeah. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of words on this page here. So, just as a summary, as the slide notes here, there are three definitions that are proposed to be added, and 7 definitions that are proposed to be revised. One thing that this slide does not include is the one definition that we continue to propose to delete, which is misleading.
Thank you, Wayne. So remind us why the ASB is proposing to delete the definition of misleading.
Well, Lisa, despite changes that were made to the 2020-21 edition of USPAP, that's the one that's currently in effect, to clarify as a part of the competency rule that perfection is impossible to attain, some stakeholders have expressed concern that a simple typographical error in a report could be viewed as misleading under a very strict reading of the current definition. The ASB considered this issue and we note the following. The conduct section of the ethics rule prohibits the appraiser from communicating results with the intent to mislead or defraud, and from allowing others to do so. The development standards, those are standards 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, address the appraiser's responsibility to not commit a substantial error of omission or commission that significantly affects an appraisal. And therefore, the ASB has concluded that the appraiser's responsibilities to avoid errors are clear and that the definition of misleading is not needed.
But why, or sorry, what new definitions are being proposed by the Appraisal Standards Board?
Well, there are 3 new definitions that are proposed in this exposure draft. Significant appraisal or appraisal review assistance, state, and summarize. So let me first alert our listeners that based upon the feedback received from stakeholders, this exposure draft includes further refinements to these 3 definitions when compared to the proposals in earlier exposure drafts. So you might want to take a look at those differences if that is of interest to you. If you felt like you were all set with our prior proposal, please just, here's a heads up. To level set for a moment, in the case of a new definition, the ASB's goal is to provide context as to the meaning of these terms which are included in USPAP but are not currently defined. And as you know, Lisa, the ASB often gets questions about significant appraisal assistance. What is it? What isn't it? The proposed definition in this case seeks to clarify what the term means in USPAP. And furthermore, state and summarize are used throughout the reporting standards, but have not been defined. With these definitions, the ASB is seeking to clarify the difference in the amount of information to be presented in each instance.
Great. Well, now let's move on to revisions that are proposed to the existing definitions. This first definition looks familiar. What can you tell us about the proposed revisions to the definition of appraiser?
Well, Lisa, in a nutshell, we are, I guess I'll say, reversing course here. We are proposing to reinstate the comment that was deleted in the current 2020-21 version of USPAP. So in the current version of USPAP, the comment that you see here was deleted, since the concepts expressed in this comment are, for the most part, covered in the preamble to USPAP. However, the deletion of the comment created confusion for some stakeholders. And the ASB's goal is for USPAP to be readable, understandable, and enforceable. Thus, the ASB has decided to revert to the definition, including the comment, which had a 20-year history in USPAP. The definition of assignment elements was also added, was added in the current 2020-21 version of USPAP. Now, the list here of 6 assignment elements contained in the current definition is spot on for an appraisal assignment. These are the time-tested, well-established assignment elements for appraisal assignments. However, as currently written, the definition pertains to both appraisal assignments and appraisal review assignments. When reviewing this definition, the board notes that the list of assignment elements is more complicated for appraisal review assignments. For example, the purpose of the appraisal review is an additional assignment element as noted in Standards Rule 3-2C. This relates to the reviewer's objectives in the assignment and drives the decision as to whether some of the other assignment elements become relevant to the appraisal review assignment. That's not to take away from the underlying appraisal assignment or appraisal report that the reviewer is reviewing, but assignment elements for the appraisal review assignment. The ASB proposes to clarify that this definition of assignment elements applies specifically to appraisal assignments. And further, we propose adding a footnote referring appraisers who are performing appraisal review assignments over to Standards Rule 3-2 for the applicable assignment elements for a review appraisal.
Great, thanks, Wayne.
Appraisal review is what I meant to say.
Yep, I heard it, I heard it. On this slide here, can you tell us about the revisions proposed to the definitions of assignment results and personal inspection?
Well, certainly. The revisions to the definition of assignment results are proposed essentially to tighten up the wording and to clarify which opinions and conclusions that are formed by an appraiser or review appraiser are truly results of an assignment that must remain confidential in order to legitimately protect the client's interests. The current wording is very broad and could encompass opinions or conclusions that should not realistically be considered assignment results. The definition of personal inspection is also proposed to be revised. And we touched on the changes proposed earlier in the exposure draft regarding inspections. So if those changes are adopted, then this definition would be renamed inspection. And further edits are being proposed based upon other feedback received from stakeholders regarding the nature of an inspection as a part of the appraisal process.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Let's see here, slide 24. Yes, looks like we have 3 more definitions proposed for revision. Tell us about these.
Well, a minor edit for consistency is proposed to the definition of intended user. Namely, we're adding the word report, the appraisal report. A minor edit, in particular, the removal of the word may, is also proposed to the definition of relevant characteristics. This edit is proposed to clear up some ambiguity noted in the standards when referencing relevant characteristics. And finally, the definition of signature is proposed to be revised. As noted earlier in the webinar, in prior exposure drafts, the ASB had proposed edits to the standards rules regarding the nature of the signature. Stakeholders' comments actually led the ASB to move some of these proposed revisions and clarifications to the definition of signature itself, rather than embellishing the definition within the standards rules.
Great. Well, this brings us to section 7 in your exposure draft, which you can find on page 26. Wayne, can you give us a quick overview of the proposed other edits?
Once again, I'm happy to do so, Lisa. As noted on this slide, the ASB continues to propose changes in 2 areas. The first is the addition of the word transfer to the sections requiring analysis and reporting of prior subject sales. And the second is an administrative edit to make the wording of Standards Rule 8-2B consistent with the parallel section of the same standards rule.
What revisions is the ASB proposing to Standards Rule 1-5B and 2-2A and B with regard to the prior sales of the subject property?
Well, Lisa, the ASB has received a number of questions regarding the analysis and reporting of a property sales history. In fact, Advisor Opinion 1 is dedicated to this topic. And there are a number of FAQs as a part of the guidance to USPAP. A lingering question in the real property arena specifically is the topic of transfers of property that are not technically sales. So for example, a transfer of a property from a former owner to a lending institution via a deed in lieu of foreclosure. So in thinking about this, the ASB considered the rationale behind the requirement to analyze sales history in general. And the ASB is therefore proposing this revision to 1-5B, as well as to the parallel references in 7-5 and 9-4 for personal property and business appraisal, respectively, to require the analysis of transfers when, and this is important, when such information is available in the normal course of business. The proposed changes actually to the companion reporting standards, that's 2-2A and B, are noted on the next slide.
So like you just said, it looks like this slide refers to the same general topic as on the prior slide. What's different?
Well, let's see. This is now, what slide are we on? We're in the right place. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm going to talk about the things that are on the slide in front of us. Okay. The proposed revision noted on this slide involves standard 8, which is personal property appraisal reporting. And this proposed revision is intended to make the language of 8-2B identical to the current 2020-21 USPAP language in 8-2A. Let's go one slide ahead, I think. Nope, let's go one slide back.
How's that?
Good. I'm seeing things about 7-5 and it threw me off for a second.
Yes, yes.
All right. So, essentially, stakeholders pointed out, why does it seem that these requirements are different? We are clarifying this language to make sure that people understand there is no difference between a requirement for an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. So as you can see, the additional proposed language about sales and transfers lives here. And it should be noted that the requirement to analyze sales and transfers in 7-5 differs from 1-5 because the requirement in 7-5 applies only when necessary for credible assignment results.
Perfect. And now we can, there we go. Now we can move to the slide, which you all just got a peek at earlier. This is on page 30 of your exposure draft. So Wayne, can you tell us about the changes proposed in section 8 of the exposure draft regarding style updates?
Well, certainly. As a quick read through the charts on actually the next few slides indicates, USPAP contains a lot of awkward he or she and his or her wording. The proposed pronoun usage revisions are designed to enhance the readability and update the wording to be consistent with current business writing. I should note at this point that in examining the pronoun usage, the revision proposed in the preamble, which is listed as item 1, we go back a slide. There we go. In item 1, it is a bit more substantive, right? The proposed revision here would add some consistency to the way the rules are presented in the preamble. And this change is referred to in the rationale for section 3, which presented the proposed changes to the preamble, but the actual wording of the proposed change lives here. I do want to point out, and I've mentioned actually throughout the presentation today that there have been some comments that we've received from stakeholders that that have helped us to shape the exposure drafts as we go. So in this case, I'd like to point out that there were some insightful comments provided by stakeholders in response to our third exposure draft. And many of those suggestions have been incorporated into this revised list of proposed changes. One last thing on this topic is it is important to note that, if these changes are adopted, the ASB will plan to make administrative edits to achieve consistent pronoun usage throughout the advisory opinions and the FAQs.
Great. Thanks for that explanation here today, Wayne. You did a great job, as always, of keeping us right on time. So we do have time left to answer some questions. We have got a couple of questions that we received earlier that I would like to ask Wayne, and then I'm going to go through the chat box here while he's answering those. The first one is, you mentioned earlier that the board is working on proposed revisions to advisory opinions that provide guidance on the number of USPAP changes proposed in the exposure draft. When do you expect these proposed changes to be released to the public for review and commentary?
Well, that's a good question, Lisa. We expect to release what we'll call sort of a supplemental exposure draft over the next, I'll say, week or two. I think we're targeting the end of next week. This will give stakeholders some time to consider the guidance and submit their comments so that we can consider those comments in our February 18th virtual work session.
And funny you should mention that because, given that the pandemic has restricted travel and in-person meetings, if the ASB decides to adopt changes to USPAP, how will that happen?
Well, Lisa, the pandemic has caused the ASB to hold meetings virtually. And although the board is not physically present in the same room, the live synchronous format of our public meetings is similar to what we would experience in an in-person public meeting. So therefore, as long as any proposed changes have been exposed to the marketplace for stakeholder comment, the process of formally adopting changes will be the same as it would be if we were physically together. Um, Come our public meeting in a month or so, if it is the will of the board to adopt changes, we will have a vote to do so during that public meeting.
And while you're having those meetings, Wayne, I mean, or even just in general, who normally gives comments to you, to the board? Is it just, people who are on the big regulatory end of it, banks, or just regular people give you comments?
Well, we don't know if all the regulators and bankers are regular people,
That's right.
but I mean, the truth is the ASB welcomes comments from all types of stakeholders, including users of appraisal services, federal government agencies, state government agencies, GSEs, appraisal membership organizations, appraisal instructors, state regulatory officials, individual appraisers, and members of the public. I've said it many times before on these exposure draft webinars and our public meetings, in person or not, but the ASB reviews every comment, no matter the source. And I've referenced a few times during this presentation about comments received and the ASB's next exposure being shaped in some way by those comments. And to be honest, while I can't source each one of those comments from memory, I do know that some of those comments may have come from a single USPAP instructor or an appraiser who is considering the impact of a potential change on their daily practice and identified a potential unintended consequence. So no, it's not just that the big banks or the a specific regulatory agency is submitting comments that cause the board to change something. Not that we don't welcome their comments, but it doesn't have to be a comment from a governmental agency in order for it to be considered by the ASB.
And I think that's a really good point, Wayne, because I've seen you all in action, and I know for a fact that every letter we get somehow just becomes a part of our memory forever. It seems like we know, maybe not exactly who said it, but we can definitely refer to it pretty quickly. I've got a question here, Wayne, from a very organized person. This person has referred us to the exact slide she had a question on. Thank you. Slide 17. Are we going to have to negate the I have or have not language on Fannie Mae's promulgated forms to be in compliance with the changes to USPAP? And by the way, she says, I think this is a great idea.
Well, thank you. I also say this, there is an appraisal modernization process going on, and over the past 6 months or so, I have had some conversations with folks who are heavily involved in that process, at the GSEs. There is some discussion. I don't know what it's actually going to look like. I'm not part of the decision-making process, but there is some discussion about making evolutionary changes to the inspection disclosure. Just as we've noted, there are evolutionary changes to what's happening out there in the marketplace. Consequently, I understand that there may be some changes to those very specific, the very specific wording that currently lives within the reports. Now, that being said, this latest revision, if you will, to or proposed revision to the certification, one would still be allowed, an appraiser would still be allowed to make a disclosure about having inspected the property. And I do know that the standardized language that I have seen, I'm not, my daily practice is not single unit residential appraisal. I'll be very upfront, and I've been upfront before on that. But in the reports that I have seen, I realize there's a fairly explicit disclosure of interior, exterior inspection, etc. That would get you most of the way there. I also understand, and I've seen commentary that, well, I have to sign, and where I sign, there's an indication of my inspection date in some cases. All right, well, now you've got I, so that's the who. You've got when, that's the date. You've got interior and exterior, that's type and extent. You're pretty well covered. You know, will there be flexibility built in so that that wording can be altered? I don't know what the intent is as far as the, if you will, the form developers, but that's the kind of disclosure that we would be talking about. You still, and as I say, we're working on the guidance. You still wouldn't be able to say, I looked at pictures taken by somebody else, so that means I did an interior inspection, right? That's what we do, and what we say now isn't going to change in that regard. It's more along the lines of, if I have seen video footage, if I have seen drone footage, if I have seen you know, the interior of a you know, a property in some other way, disclosing how that occurred or what that was all about is likely more important than just saying, I did not make a personal inspection.
Okay, great. We have another question on the Fannie Mae format, and this is a really good question because I think this is going to be a common question we're going to have, Wayne. And in my reading of it, I'll read it to you here real quick. It's going to be about the difference between the USPAP certification and the Fannie Mae certification. So here's the question. Fannie Mae forms are embedded with certification pages that need to be signed. Based upon the foregoing, if the Fannie Mae certification is signed and the appraiser is effectively certifying and taking full responsibility for all content of the appraisal report, then why would it be further necessary to add or include another signed certification disclosing prior services? Are you hearing that the same way I am, Wayne?
Well, I guess I do. Prior service disclosure is not really a topic that we've been batting about in terms of changing that. There's an ongoing discussion, I guess, and I know we have guidance and FAQs about this topic. Sometimes, back in the day, there were printed forms that had a printed certification that lived in the document itself. And in the event that there were supplemental certifications of specific items that USPAP required, it was necessary to add a supplemental certification. So whether it's prior service disclosure or any other item, this is a practice that has gone on for a while. Again, I don't know what the appraisal modernization process will come up with in terms of flexibility to add certain items that are required under USPAP or required for a particular client in the certification, required perhaps by a membership organization or whatever else. I don't know whether any flexibility will be built into that, but if not, and if those certification elements are required and expected, then a supplemental certification is necessary. I recall in a prior cycle of potential USPAP changes that there was discussion about whether or not that supplemental certification had to have a second signature on it. That is not required under USPAP. We floated that out there, but again, because of some of these structural items in software, it was not a simple matter to sign, if you will, a supplemental certification. So if that's the nature of the question, no, you don't have to sign it, but you do have to have it.
Okay, great. I know that the board has received some comment letters about the issue of other transfers. somebody here is wondering about other transfers and adding that language as it relates to conservation easements. I don't know if this is something you can answer, Wayne, but I will put it out there. Someone is thinking that adding this verbiage could cause somebody to have a lot of issues around conservation easement related issues. Has the board talked about that at all? Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, it's interesting, that we have received some commentary, and frankly, over the last 5 years or so, we've received some questions about, I guess I would say, ethical matters, maybe, or potential ethical matters surrounding conservation easement appraisals. And we've received those inquiries from individual appraisers. We've received them from federal agencies. Uh, you know, what it kind of gets back to is there is ownership structure and there is the sale or transfer of real property. The question becomes, what does the appraiser know, and is it germane to telling the story of the subject history of transfer? I think an appraiser has to make a decision about what they know and what they're telling their client. And to the extent that they know it and it's something that's germane to the assignment that their client should know about, then the appraiser has to determine whether they should report it. There is as I understand it, there are some IRS issues surrounding all of these elements. And in some cases, I understand that an appraiser may not know that the ownership behind an LLC or some other corporation has changed. They may or may not be able to, in the normal course of business, understand those elements, and consequently, it may not be reasonable for them to report a portion of what they know. That's just sort of practical day to day. But I don't know that ASB can do or should do as a part of USPAP is try to arbitrate that issue between government agencies and the appraisers and attorneys who work on specific transactions. The point of USPAP is to say we want to protect the public trust. Appraisers should do the right thing ethically, competently within the appraisal report. Transfers may, the requirement to report transfers may cause those appraisers who are working on those types of assignments to report what they know. And in theory, that should help to protect the public trust.
Great. Next question. Significant appraisal assistance, always a popular topic, appears to only apply to licensed appraisers. How does this impact the non-appraiser or the trainee? Seems like, as worded, the non-appraiser and trainee may be exempt from being disclosed.
Yeah, it's interesting. We get a lot of questions about a state's classification of an individual in terms of licensure, right, versus what does that person do? And is a trainee, that I guess the question that someone has to decide is a trainee who may technically not have, maybe it just says trainee on their business card or on their license, maybe it says registered, something else. Are they performing duties that are appraisal related? Does the client, does the supervisor have a belief that what they're doing is independent, unbiased, etc.? And is it part of the appraisal process? If it is, then irrespective of their licensure level, from a USPAP perspective, they are an appraiser. Right? Now, I know individual states may have a different take on who can be considered an appraiser. I don't know of situations, and it might be a question for the appraisal subcommittee or your individual state appraiser board as to whether there's any prohibition on listing someone as providing significant appraisal assistance if they are not a licensed or certified appraiser. I have had some recent conversations. In fact, we had a recent monthly call, and some representatives from the appraisal subcommittee were reminding me, frankly, I used to be on the appraiser qualifications board, were reminding me that some states find it hard to give a trainee experience unless they're named as providing significant appraisal assistance within the certification of an appraiser. So consequently, it makes sense that those folks are providing that assistance, and that assists them in earning their hours toward licensure or certification.
Okay, that was a very good answer. Thank you. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question here. What does it say? What does explicitly mean? Is this adjective necessary? So this would be for the definition. Definition of assignment results explicitly in support of assignment. What does the Appraisal Standards Board mean by that?
We're talking about the definition of significant appraisal assistance.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I don't have it open in front of me, but the concept of explicitly in support of a
Particular.
right, a specific assignment. Right. So the point is, if you go to your local membership meeting or you have a Zoom call, your membership meeting, you float an issue out to someone, hey, in general, I appraise this kind of property, and they give you something to think about, or they tell you about a particular comparable or something along those lines, you go back and use that information in your appraisal report. Have they provided significant appraisal assistance? We're working on the further guidance on this, but this has been a long-standing significant appraisal assistance has been addressed in guidance for a while. No, that's not significant appraisal assistance. Probably, if you deem that it is, then fine. But unless you said, I am working on this assignment, I would like your help. Here are the facts and figures. You're an appraiser. I want you to provide that assistance as an appraiser. Tell me what I should do here in this very specific assignment. Okay, well, if you go down the list of items in the definition of significant appraisal assistance, have they fulfilled those items? If they have, on this specific assignment, then yes, you would likely come to the conclusion that you should name them as having provided significant appraisal assistance.
Okay. Thank you, Wayne. Just in the last few minutes, we've had a lot more questions and comments come in, but we are out of time. So just rest assured that all of these comments and questions have been captured. They will be provided to the Appraisal Standards Board. So we will review these, and I'm sorry we've run out of time. We can't answer all of those. So just to wrap up for today, we just want everybody to know that we do want to hear from you again. Always like to emphasize that the Appraisal Standards Board operates in a very open, transparent manner. They are genuinely interested in hearing what appraisers, clients, regulators, educators, members of the public have to say about the proposed revisions to USPAP. So please respond to this exposure draft. Tell us what you think. This page includes 2 methods that you can use to comment, either via the SurveyMonkey link, or you can just send in an email. And as noted here, written comments are due by February 17th, which is just prior to our February 19th virtual public meeting. Please sign up for the live stream via the link Aida has posted in the chat box here. And with that, I just want to wrap up and thank you very much for being here today. As soon as we close out, there will be a quick webinar survey. Again, please fill those out. Those are very helpful to us. And thank you for listening. And Wayne, do you have any closing comments?
No closing comments, just to emphasize, we really do want your feedback on this, as well as the supplemental advisory opinion exposure that, like I say, we're very much hoping to have out by the end of next week.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day out there.
Thank you.